Hi, my name is Taylor Ho, and today I'll be presenting on the polio vaccine. The full name of the disease is poliomyelitis. Some more common names would be polio, infantile paralysis, or Hindman's disease. The infectious agent behind it is an RNA virus called poliovirus. It is part of the genus Enterovirus in the family Coronaviridae. There are three serotypes, type 1, type 2, and type 3. So polio enters through the mouth and replicates in the oropharynx and the GI tract by invading the local lymphoid tissue, and it can then enter into the bloodstream and infect cells in the central nervous system by destruction of the motor neurons. This can result in distinctive paralysis, which is a side effect of paralytic polio, but the transmission usually occurs through the fecal-oral route, which happens in the contamination of feces in food and water that usually occurs in unsanitary conditions. Asymptomatic transmission is also possible. So the usual incubation period for polio is 3 to 6 days for non-paralytic polio, and then 7 to 10 days after onset of paralysis for paralytic polio, but it can last up to 21 days. So the vaccine types I'll be talking about today are the inactivated polio vaccine, which is an inactivated killed vaccine that is administered in the U.S. It is administered intramuscularly or subcutaneously, and then the oral polio vaccine, which is not used in the U.S. anymore, is a live attenuated vaccine that is administered orally through drops in the mouth. So these are listed down here are combination vaccines, which the IPV vaccine is also administered in combination with other vaccines. So a little history into polio in the U.S. So in 1894 was the first epidemic in the U.S. It was reported in Vermont, in which there were 132 cases, and of those 18 deaths. Due to the high mortality rate, there was a large push for research into poliovirus and into the development of the vaccine. In the 1930s, there was a spike in the number of cases, as you can see right here. And one of the cases was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a large advocate for the development of a vaccine. And then in the 1950s, there were more than 21,000 paralytic cases of polio, with children under 5 being the ones that are mainly affected. This caused quarantines to be imposed on homes and towns in which polio cases were diagnosed. Travel and commerce were also restricted between some cities during this time due to the high rates of polio cases. So in 1952, Jonas Salk, who was a virologist in the U.S., began his early vaccine trials by testing a trivalent vaccine that was using a human-killed virus to protect against polio. So these subjects that they used were mainly children who were physically and mentally disabled. The vaccine trials were a success, and in 1954 there was massive vaccine distribution in the U.S. using Salk's vaccine. And then in 1960, Albert Sabin, a virologist who worked with the Soviet health officials to find a cheaper alternative to Salk's vaccine, in which he created the oral polio vaccine. It was then licensed in the U.S. in 1960, and then in combination with the IPV vaccine, the distribution was able to reach lots of people, and polio was eradicated from the U.S. in 1979. 2000, there was a new and improved version of Salk's IPV that led to the U.S. to adopt an IPV-only vaccine schedule, essentially phasing out the use of the oral polio vaccine due to its risk of infecting people with vaccine-derived polio. And then in 2021, there is a new vaccine that has been developed and granted emergency use by the World Health Organization because there are type 2 specific viruses that are the main sources of outbreaks. So the new vaccine is a type 2 specific virus vaccine. There are 2 types of polio, non-paralytic polio and paralytic polio. These symptoms listed right here are most commonly associated with non-paralytic polio, but these symptoms in combination with more severe symptoms like paresthesia, meningitis, and paralysis are most likely paralytic poliovirus, which affect the brain and spinal cord. So out of every 200 infections, one case leads to paralysis, which usually occurs in the legs. About 5 to 10% of people who are paralyzed by polio eventually die because their muscles aren't able to breathe. So the way that polio is diagnosed is usually through a diagnosis of symptoms in combination with the PCR test, which is used to differentiate between wild strains from vaccine-like strains. This is done by collecting two stool specimens 24 hours apart within 14 days after onset of symptoms. The lumbar puncture is not really a common way to diagnose polio because cerebral spinal fluid does contain a large number of leukocytes, and it has mildly elevated proteins, which can lead to nonspecific findings, so it is uncommon for this to be used. Viral culture is the most sensitive method to diagnose polio because polio is isolated from stool specimens or isolated from pharyngeal swabs. And then serologic testing is usually only done in support of diagnosis of paralytic poliomyelitis. This is especially if patients are known or suspected to have not been vaccinated. So to do serologic testing, they get an acute serum as soon as possible, and then 3 weeks later, they obtain a convalescent serum to be analyzed. So currently, there is no cure for polio. So the best preventative treatment is to get the vaccine. But for those that have been infected with polio, they recommend bed rest, good nutrition, and physical therapy and moderate exercise. These treatments are only available to alleviate symptoms and improve the quality of life. The physical therapy is recommended to prevent deformities and loss of muscle function. So typically, some side effects of polio are muscle atrophy and muscle weakness, which is typically found in the legs. But in some cases, it can also cause weakness of the neck and throat muscles, which often lead to difficulty swallowing and talking. It can also cause weakness of the abdomen muscles, back muscles, the muscles that lift your foot. Paralysis is a side effect of polio and is often symmetrical, but any limb can be affected. Some research suggests that the spread occurs via the afferent nerve pathway in the brain, as poliovirus does have an affinity for the cellular receptor CD155 that helps in cell attachment. So this primarily affects the destruction to the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, which can lead to limb paralysis, which is the reason why paralysis is often a side effect of polio. So this is the mechanism of action for the inactivated polio vaccine. So after immunization with the viral antigen, the dendritic cells take up the viral antigen and instruct the T helper cells that are specific for this viral antigen to help antibody-producing B cells and cytotoxic T cells. The dendritic cells then take up and process the vaccine antigens and present them by the major histocompatibility complex to class 2 molecules to the CD4 plus T cells. These cells are then able to differentiate into the CD4 plus T helper cells and the CD8 plus T cells into the cytotoxic lymphocyte, which eliminate the virus. So after the decay of the primary immune response, both memory B and T cells are formed, which means that after contact with this virus, they can immediately trigger an immune response with the viral antigen and prevent the proliferation and survival of the virus in the case of infection with the virus. The duration of the immunity is unknown, but is thought to be lifelong. So the vaccine prevents the wild polio virus from reaching the central nervous system in people who have been vaccinated, and this prevents paralysis. So some side effects that have been reported after vaccination would be induration, pain, and erythema. So this percentage is 90% of people develop antibodies after 2 doses, and at least 99% are immune after 3 doses. The inactivated polio vaccine. The recommended vaccine schedule for infants and children who have not been vaccinated against polio. So the 4 doses of IPV vaccine are administered at each of the corresponding dates. There is an accelerated schedule available for children who are traveling internationally to countries where polio is still present. And then for adults who've never been vaccinated against polio, they're going to receive 3 doses of the inactivated polio vaccine. The first dose at any time, and then the following doses at these corresponding times. Booster vaccines are available for those who are more susceptible to polio or have more risk of exposure to polio. And then these are the components of the inactivated polio vaccine, which is the only vaccine that is currently being used and administered in the US. So the IPV vaccine contains it actually is grown in monkey kidney cells, and then it's inactivated with formaldehyde. It contains these three antibiotics: neomycin, streptomycin, and polymyxin B, and then it is preserved using 2-phenoxyethanol. It contains 3 serotypes, type 1, type 2, and 3 of poliovirus. It was originally formulated by Jonas Salk, which I referred to before, but it has been replaced with enhanced potency in the late 1980s. So these are some myths that have been said about the polio vaccine. So the first is that vaccine contains anti-fertility agents. This is a common myth about vaccines in general, but there's no scientific evidence to prove this. And then the next one would be the vaccines shouldn't be given multiple times. This is very untrue, as each additional dose is essential in strengthening the immunity level of those who are being vaccinated against polio. And there's also no risk of overdose, as some people are claiming. So the main one that is said in the U.S. is polio has been eradicated from the U.S. So it's no longer necessary to vaccinate children against it. This is entirely false, because polio is still widespread in other parts of the world, and it could easily begin reinfecting unprotected individuals if it is reintroduced to the country. So these are some recent developments in the fight to eradicate polio from the world. So some recent outbreaks have been found in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as the Philippines. But Afghanistan and Pakistan are the only 2 remaining polio endemic countries in the world. In Afghanistan, from January to July 2020, there were 41 cases of wild polio reported. And then in September 2019 in the Philippines, there were 2 cases of vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2. It was also found to be the reason for the outbreak in Afghanistan as well. So due to the number of outbreaks that are linked to the type 2 vaccine-derived polio virus, there has been new and improved a poliovirus type 2 oral vaccine that is specifically targeting type 2 of the poliovirus. The vaccine has been in development and has recently just been approved by the World Health Organization for emergency use to help contain these outbreaks and hopefully eradicate polio. So the work being done by the Polio Global Eradication Initiative is specifically targeting these endemic countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan, by committing financial resources as well as open political communication in Afghanistan and Pakistan to eradicate polio by vaccinating all children and adults who have never been vaccinated against polio. So here is my works cited page. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to all your questions.